Tom Clancy's The Division, a game with endless opinions on it as well as many accolades. A few noteworthy ones: it is cited as a game featuring one of the most egregious examples of overpromising in its original trailer compared to what was delivered on launch day. Up until the release of Elden Ring, Division 1 held the title for 6 years of the highest selling new IP game of all time. And it's my favorite game of all time. That last one being important because today I want to step back in time and talk about what it was really like to play the original Division. Because as somebody who was there on launch day, I saw it all. Nowadays I extensively covered the Division 2 on the channel, and because the Division's last official content update was over 5 years ago, my goodness, that's led to a lot of discussion over time. People claiming everything the game did was perfect and superior to The Division 2, people who never played the original game and have only experienced it by going back in the recent months and years after it received all of its updates, and in general, people who have either just forgotten or never knew its full story. So, that's what I want to do today. I want to walk back through time, point out some of the notable events, and talk about some of my own experience through the years and many updates that the game received, ultimately making it, as I said, my favorite game of all time. If you enjoy retrospectives like these and want more content on everything Division in the future, then consider clicking that subscribe button. I would greatly appreciate it. Only thing I want to point out before we begin, I did not start creating videos for this game or at all until much later into the Division 1's life, so aside from old Xbox clips I've stored, I have none of my own record or footage from back in the day. That said, if any outside sources are used for visual demonstration, any content owners or creators will be credited with links down in the description below. But to start off, let's take it back to day 1. March 8th, 2016, launch day of Tom Clancy's The Division. I got home from school that day, and my pre-order copy of the game was waiting in the mail, and yes, ordering physical discs was at least semi-normal back then. I popped it into my Xbox One and found myself immediately thrown into the middle of winter in Brooklyn, New York. The most memorable part of this initial experience, it's been memed to death online, the safe house in the zone was a social space where you could see other players, and this meant that on day 1, when everyone was starting out in the same spot, it was packed. So much so that in order to avoid being unable to complete a necessary interact with the laptop on the shade coordinator's table, players single file lined their way all the way back towards the door. It's a rather endearing memory. I recall my wait in line quite well. Although if you told me that interacting with that laptop would sign away the next decade of my gaming life, maybe I'd have run back out the door, who knows. The launch of The Division was more or less a typical launch. A huge surge of players, issues encountered, many fun moments had. I was much less of a critic back then, and I just remember my friend and I agreeing while making our way through the campaign that we had never experienced a game like this before, and I stand by that statement to this day. Where things really began to get interesting was once the majority of people hit the end game. Now, I don't see this talked about often, so maybe people just don't remember, but when it first released, The Division didn't really have much of an end game. There were a few main missions that would rotate into providing the highest replayable difficulty on a weekly basis, but other than that, there were no pinnacle modes, the open world was quite lifeless, at least in terms of content. There was one experience for people to dive into, however, and that was the Dark Zone. Now, say what you will on whether or not you like the Dark Zone or you agree with its philosophy, but this was the point in time in the franchise's history where the Dark Zone may have had the most purpose, because it was this big endgame zone. It provided high quality gear, you could farm credits for exclusive Dark Zone blueprints that gave you some of the best weapons and gear in the game, and I would say this is when the DZ's lawless and unpredictable nature was at its height. One of my favorite memories being going into game chat at an extraction zone with close to the entire server being present, and I loudly proclaimed about my anxiety carrying the most desired endgame weapon at the time, the Midas, in my contaminated bag. I then watched as chaos quickly unfolded and every team and agent on that rooftop began an all-out brawl to claim the reward. The best part? I never had a Midas. My best guess is that there was a purple chest piece in my bag. Things were not all peachy, however, this was likely also one of the DZ's most unbalanced periods in history, as both the devs and the players were learning how to navigate this kind of an experience. And while that certainly was not fun for all, it did provide some pretty unforgettable moments. Like this, may be my favorite clip of all time. In the weeks after launch, the overall reception was mixed. The absence of a real endgame bugged many, also the lack of delivered promises from the trailer didn't help, but for people like myself, and there were many, the world and gameplay loop had hooked us. The following two updates began to remedy things. Incursions were introduced, providing an actual endgame experience to grind each week. And what would new Division content be without its bugs? Proud to say that I Farm Falcon lost a lot using this one. Along with that, we got the HVT system to aid progression, some Dark Zone additions like rope cutting and supply drops, and loot sharing. Fun fact, that feature did not exist when the Division launched. The next major event to talk about, I feel, was 1.3. The Division's first expansion release, Underground, was tied to the 1.3 update. Now, it's not the content itself that is necessarily noteworthy, rather the overall state of the game. Now, there's been periods of high difficulty in the Division's history, a more recent example being after the release of Warlords of New York for the Division 2. But 1.3 was something different, and if you've ever heard people say the phrase, I think it was even put onto t-shirts, I survived patch 1.3, this was why. Now, one-shot shotgunners were the face of the problem here, but overall they represented a larger issue the game was facing of having a whole lot of grind for not a lot of reward, all structured within an endgame that had been propped up by a few solid additions, but really still lacked that continuity and glue. The players felt this. This patch was the time that many began to drop from the game, and the developers realized this, and so that was when they made a very radical decision. One that I argue truly changed the trajectory for the Division, and in all seriousness has to be at least partly responsible for why the game and franchise has stuck around for as long as it has. Update 1.4. Now here's the thing, Update 1.4 was always going to happen as it was originally meant to be paired with the game's second expansion, Survival, but the devs realized that the game needed some foundational change, more so than just any other update could do to improve the experience. So, they pushed back Survival and the original plans for 1.4 by a few months, turning that into 1.5 and carved out time in the release schedule for 1.4. An unplanned, somewhat emergency patch aimed at revitalizing the Division and its endgame. This is where many famous Division staples were originated, things like the public test server and the Elite Task Force, two programs and processes still used to this day. And while the update didn't add any new notable content additions, it improved and rebalanced just about everything it could. World tiers were introduced, allowing players to modify their overall game difficulty. Vendors got an overhaul to make them more worthwhile. Rewards for just about every endgame activity got buffed and repurposed. Balancing happened across all kinds of gear, weapon and skills. Quality of life improved across the board. Overall, 1.4 was just a really solid patch, aimed at remedying all the players' major grievances. And it was a success, pleasing current players and drawing in lapsed ones. And it set the stage for what I consider to be kind of the golden age of the Division 1, that time between patch 1.4 and 1.6. Updates were frequent, the devs were trying to get all of this content released that they had already had planned before 1.4 bumped things back, and they had to do it within the 1-year mark of the game's release to meet contractual obligations. PvE players had more to do than ever with the revitalized and more rewarding endgame. Survival released, which not only provided enjoyment for both PvE and PvP players, but also proved to be the Division's most famous and beloved game mode of all time. 1.6 was, to this day, the Division franchise's largest PvP patch ever, introducing Last Stand, the game's 8v8 PvP mode. DZ North was introduced, giving players all new places to explore there. I just recall logging on day after day after day and having an endless amount of fun each time. Now we'll take off the rose-tinted glasses, not everything was perfect. The Seeker Mine and Alpha Bridge metas were having their time in the spotlight for PvP back then, that was memorable. But overall, just the sheer volume and frequency of content and updates was a lot of fun to experience. And Update 1.6.1 introduced loadouts. Can you believe that we went through an entire year of the Division without loadouts? In this day and age, I certainly cannot. After 1.6 was the game's 1-year anniversary, and there was a lot of uncertainty heading into it. We had reached the end of the roadmap. Would they be announcing a sequel, a second year of content, dropping support for the game altogether? We got our answer, and it was that the game would receive 2 more major updates in year 2, both later in the year. This led to a few months of slowness with things before eventually arrived Update 1.7. Now, 1.7 was notable for a couple of reasons. For one, similar to 1.4, it introduced some staples that we still know to this day, things like commendations and global events. But on a more personal level, 1.7 is when myself and many others agree that Division PvP was at its best. My goodness, I go to bed at night and weep that we no longer have 1.7 to play for PvP. Hybrid builds were on top, which were basically exactly as they sounded, hybrid setups that utilized different categories of bonuses, often granting a good middle ground of damage, incoming damage reduction, and healing. But there was room for experimentation within that. High-end builds were viable, exotics were viable, gear sets were viable. The meta had a relatively quick overall time to kill, which just felt incredibly refreshing and snappy. PvP was simply fun, and more than anything, balanced. As always, it wasn't perfect, but it was far better than I argue anything we've ever had at any other time in the franchise. And to this day, I long for Ubisoft to add a Legacy 1.7 server for people to go and play. 1.7's greatness was, unfortunately, rather short-lived, because later into its lifespan and heading into Update 1.8, global events begin rewarding more and more classified gear sets, which were enhanced versions of gear sets that we already had. They offered higher base stats as well as 5 and 6 piece set bonuses. Now some argue that the classified era was the Division's greatest, as it gave these global events immense appeal given everyone wanted classifieds, it was a universal desire to grind for. On the flip side, and the reason I've never advocated for these to return in the Division 2, classifieds devastated the absolutely heavenly balancing point PvP had reached by 1.7. Their higher stats meant that you were quite literally at a disadvantage if you ran anything other than them, and their 6-piece bonuses were so strong that it meant they also were almost a requirement to have. This was mostly a symptom of 1.8, however, so let's talk about the Division's biggest post-launch update as well as its final one, 1.8, which is what I would refer to as a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it delivered a ton of new content. New open-world areas of the West Side Piers, introducing all new open-world content variety that was much more engaging and replayable. Resistance was an all-new Horde-like mode with 3 maps. The Conflict PvP mode was added, Underground got a complete rework that made it much more appealing and rewarding. Media outlets came back to the game and reviewed it based on its 1.8 merits, claiming that the game was now in a phenomenal state. And I think many agreed that had the game launched with this kind of a comprehensive endgame, it would have been regarded way higher than it was at the time. Now that's all great at a top level, but on the ground, as someone who played 1.8 and talked to many people who did during and after the fact, the effect of classified gear sets was quite a problematic one that ended up bleeding into PvE as well as just PvP. It offered players more power than they had ever had before, and that undoubtedly felt awesome. However, the side effect of that was that build diversity tanked to a lower point than at any other time in the Division's history. If you weren't running a classified set, you weren't competing. And the problem there is that the Division's DNA is built on experimentation. The game gets carried through content routes by the fact that people can continually come up with new ways to play through the existing content. And classifieds, particularly the ones released in 1.8, really killed that. The update was still great overall, and it carried the Division to its highest critical praise it ever got. But for me, especially as someone who plays a lot of PvP, the 1.8 era was never quite as high on my list as it was for some. Heading into early 2018, the game was nearing its 2-year anniversary, and that March we got the announcement that The Division 2 was in development. I remember the moment I learned about that quite vividly. After that, The Division received patches 1.8.1 through 1.8.3, which delivered a few balancing changes as well as brought us new legendary missions. And that was it. 1.8.3 was the last update The Division 1 ever received back in mid-2018. Going back through the game's history and events has been quite fun for me, and it's also reminded me of just how funny the comments are from people who say that The Division 1 was perfect in every little way. The game had big stumbles. It took quite a long time to really find its stride with a meaningful endgame. A lot of its content and systems went through many reworks, and compared to The Division 2, many menu and quality of life features the sequel has makes it perplexing how we weren't pulling our hair out in the original. That said, like I stated at the beginning, The Division is my favorite game of all time. Despite what issues it had, it also provided an amazing third-person looter-shooter experience unlike anything I had ever played before. The immersion of its winterized apocalyptic world remains the most enthralling digital space I've ever explored, and while I don't prefer every mechanic and movement aspect compared to the sequel, the culmination of movement and combat in the original remains superior in my mind, particularly for how that translated into PvP. But, my friends, that was a look at how it really was to play The Division 1. An imperfect game, but one that sent me down a path I thought I would never take, so for that, I will always be grateful. Let me know your thoughts on this discussion. If you did play The Division during its time, then what were some of your best memories? And if not, what stood out to you in this recounting? That's going to do it for me today, everybody. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. RogueGold. Ow.